Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar that we're calling Turning to Transmission, How New York State is Planning for the Future of Renewable Energy. My name is Alex Lamont, and I'm a Legislative and Policy Coordinator for the New York State Association of Counties. The Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, also known as the Climate Act, set an ambitious mandate for New York State to obtain 70% of the state's energy from renewable sources by 2030. A lot of attention has been paid to the wind and solar projects that will need to be built to meet this goal. But an equally important part of this discussion that has often been overlooked is transmission, or how we're going to transmit the energy from these projects to the grid and get electricity to customers. New and upgraded transmission systems will be needed to move thousands of megawatts of renewable energy from where it is generated to where it will be consumed. This webinar aims to provide an introduction to this topic and prepare our members for the transmission projects that may be coming to their counties to support the Climate Act goals. Before we begin, I would like to thank our sponsor, NYPA, the New York Power Authority, for sponsoring today's webinar. From energy efficiency solutions and professional advisory services to solar, energy storage, LED streetlights, EV infrastructure, and digital energy management, NYPA provides turnkey solutions for all of your energy and sustainability needs. Through these services and their power programs, NYPA's experts help you to achieve your energy goals and save money. We thank NYPA for their support of NYSAC's educational events. Now I'd like to turn it over to Jeanette Stanziano, NYSAC Director of Education and Training, for some housekeeping items.
Thank you, Alex. Just a couple of points before we begin. We are recording this webinar and we'll be posting it to the NYSAC website at nysac.org for your review at any time. You can find this by going to webinars and then looking under the archived webinars under today's date. We also encourage you to feel free to submit questions at any time during the presentation. Questions will be answered at 2 points, one in the middle of the program and at another point during the Q&A following the conclusion of the program. Please submit your questions in writing through your dashboard. Just click on the questions tab. It'll drop down and you can type in your question and press submit. Thanks so much. Alex, back to you.
Thank you, Jeanette. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Elizabeth Pizarro, who is a policy advisor in the Office of Electric, Gas, and Water at the New York State Department of Public Service. Elizabeth leads the department's implementation of the 2020 Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth Act, with calls for the revision of transmission planning processes to achieve the state's climate goals. She also serves as the co-chair of the state's Interconnection Policy Working Group, working with developers and utilities to streamline and improve the interconnection process for distributed energy sources. In past lives, Liz served as a managing attorney with DPS's Office of General Counsel, as an assistant attorney general in the office or in the Environmental Protection Bureau of the New York State Attorney General's Office, as in-house counsel to the New York Independent System Operator, or MEGSO, and as general counsel to a renewable energy development company. She holds a JD degree from NYU Law School and a BA in History and Literature from Harvard University. Now I'd like to turn it over to Liz. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction. I hope you can hear me. Is the audio coming through all right?
Yes, it is.
Great, that's terrific. And again, many thanks for inviting me. This is a really crucial topic, and I'm excited to be presenting on transmission to all of you today, and hope that you feel free when we're done to reach out and pursue further questions if you want to. But here today, I want to give you a high level overview of the work that we are doing at the Department of Public Service. And by the way, my agency, the Department of Public Service, is the staff agency that supports your Public Service Commission, which is the entity that regulates New York State utilities. So I want to give you a high-level overview of what we at the staff level and in partnership with the Commission are doing to solve, to understand and solve the transmission problem. And I also want to mention in passing, I'm sure a lot of you have had occasion to work in the siting, transmission siting context. And most of my presentation today will be focused not so much on siting, but rather on the process whereby proposals get identified, scoped, funded before they actually enter the siting process. We're looking a little further back in the project development cycle. I'm sure there may be some questions on siting. I'm happy to answer them, but my focus is primarily how do we plan the transmission that we think we're going to need to meet our climate goals. So a quick reminder, as Alex mentioned, we as a state have very aggressive climate targets. They are focused on specific goals by 2030 to reach a 70% renewable generation portfolio. To hit a zero emission electric portfolio by 2040, 10 years later, an 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from their 1990 levels by 2050. And in order to get to these targets, the statute provides for some specific electric supply thresholds. In other words, we are aiming for 6,000 megawatts or 6 gigawatts of distributed solar resources online by 2025, 3,000 megawatts of storage in place by 2030, and 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind supply by 2035. Next slide, please. I think it helps to take a minute and talk a little bit about what the electric grid does and what some of its component parts are. So this is a slide that I borrowed from one of my old employer, the New York ISO, which is the organization that runs the transmission system in New York, to illustrate, from a basic way, what the grid consists of. So on the left-hand side, you see a column of generators. You see probably a nuclear power plant, some wind plants, some other stuff there in that column. So we have a diverse set of generating plants that produce the energy. It has to get to customers, which is the block on the far right-hand side of this graph, of this chart. So what happens along the way? Well, we have to step up the voltage to the transmission level. That happens at the transformer. Then once we get the electricity onto the high voltage transmission lines, which are capable of distributing the energy across large regions, so we transmit the energy at the high voltage. Then once we get the energy closer to where it needs to be, again, we have to transform and step it down to a distribution level voltage. And then once the energy is on the lower voltage system, the distribution system, it has to be distributed to all of the various customers who are there on the right-hand side of this graph. So, and that's a basic picture of what the grid does for us today. And the problem or the conundrum that we are facing is that our set of generators over there on the left-hand side is going to change dramatically between now and 2040, assuming that we meet those CLCPA targets. So if you change the generating mix, especially if you change it as dramatically as we're going to do, you have to change what happens in the middle, in the transmission part of this graph, in order to get all of the energy produced by that new set of generators to the customers on the right-hand side. Next slide, please. So how do we figure out what the grid will need as the generating portfolio changes to continue to operate reliably and continue to provide electricity to customers? Well, my agency, the Public Service Commission, and our sister agency, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, or NYSERDA, we undertook a pretty comprehensive study that we call the Power Grid Study over the 2020 to 21 time period to try to get a preliminary identification of what electric system upgrades would be needed on the CLCPA time horizons of 2030 and 2040. I'm going to emphasize this is a preliminary, preliminary understanding of what those system needs are or might be. The power grid study had 3 components that we'll be talking about a little bit today. The first component was a study actually conducted by the utilities, so I refer to it as the utility study, which looked primarily at their part of the system, which is mostly the distribution, that is lines that go into the customer's facilities, the distribution, and then local transmission systems. And when I say local transmission, I mean basically not the high voltage system, not the system that carries energy, across the state, but a lower level of the system that brings the energy down from that highway and then crosses the gap to the distribution system, which is what comes to your house or your business. So that was the utility study. We also performed what we call the zero emission study, or the 100 by 40 study, which looked at, okay, if we really get to the zero emission target in 2040, what is that going to look like? And then another piece was a study of how we would integrate the 9,000 megawatt target set by the CLCPA for offshore wind. Next slide, please. And we took away some high-level findings that we've continued to pursue, and I'll briefly run through those. One key finding is that investment in our grid is going to be needed throughout the state as the supply portfolio changes. Those changes in supply are going to occur everywhere. And so, the modifying the grid to accommodate that new supply is going to impact all regions of the state in one way or another. A good finding was that some of the recent investments that we have been making, particularly in high voltage transmission, have put us in a good position to meet those 2030 targets. 2040 is another question, but we've made some strides in recent years that are going to really help us get to the 2030 targets. We found that integrating the 9 gigawatts of offshore wind looks likely to be achievable. We also concluded that some investment in the distribution and local transmission systems that are managed by the utilities, that alone may be enough to meet the 2030 targets, and that we're going to need more studies to figure out what other transmission needs we may have as the supply portfolio changes and gets closer and closer to the 2040 targets. So most of these findings were pretty good news, particularly that we are well on track to meet 2030, and that getting to the main thing that we may need to get to 2030 would be a program of distribution and local transmission upgrades. So next slide, please. So I want to focus a little bit on those local upgrades, because those are some of the kinds of projects that many folks in this organization are likely to see in future years. So in the power grid study, we identified 2 kinds of local upgrades that are going to be needed. And again, these are going to crop up all across the state. The first category of projects we call phase 1, and these are the typical utility projects that utilities conduct all the time, that are part of their traditional system investments, that are aimed at keeping the system working optimally, maintaining reliability, replacing aging assets, and meeting standards for resiliency. So these are the kinds of investments utilities make every day. That when you see utility trucks out working, that these are kinds of things they are doing. Those are phase 1 projects. They happen to have, in addition to their traditional benefits of reliability or resiliency, phase 1 projects have some CLCPA benefit, typically some ability to increase the local system's capacity to handle more renewable generation. Phase 2 projects, in contrast, are not driven by the traditional utility investment criteria. They are system upgrades that are specifically driven to meet CLCPA requirements. So phase 2 projects, broadly speaking, represent work that the utilities would not be doing but for CLCPA needs. Good news is that the phase 1 projects, the typical utility system investment, have significant potential to get us most of the way to the 2030 goals. But we do expect phase 2 projects to be needed as that supply portfolio changes across the strait and more renewables come online in that 2030 to 2040 period. Next slide, please. The Power Grid study also pointed to some bulk system investments. And what I mean by bulk system is that high voltage system that transmits energy across regions of the state. So again, pretty good news. The Power Grid study did not see any major need, any significant need for bulk transmission investment before the 2030 timeframe, with one exception that we'll talk about some more, and that is there will be a need for an additional connector tie between Long Island and the mainland. However, after 2035, the integration of our offshore wind supply and the shift to renewables elsewhere in the state are going to drive the need for new bulk or high voltage system investments. So we're going to see a shift. We're probably focusing on the local needs for the next 8, 9, 10 years, and then shifting towards the bulk needs in the period following that. Next slide. So what are those offshore wind transmission needs? Well, the Power Grid study pointed to a couple of things. One was that you have to figure out where to land the energy, where to interconnect it to the existing grid. And the Power Grid study suggested that an optimum allocation might be to land 3 gigawatts of offshore wind supply directly to Long Island, and the other 6 gigawatts to interconnection points in New York City. So we are pretty focused on trying to meet that 6-3 allocation. The Power Grid study pointed out that if you land another 3 gigawatts of energy on Long Island, you need a new tie line to the mainland so that up to 3 gigawatts of energy can flow off Long Island to the rest of the state. And the study also suggested that, or emphasized really, that we need to identify interconnection points in New York City capable of handling that 6 gigawatts of additional supply. As part of looking at interconnection points, the Power Grid study tells us that we really need to look at cable routing options because getting all this supply into the very restricted environments of New York Harbor, there's a lot of questions there. So next slide, please. I'm going to pause here. What I've tried to do is give you a very high-level summary of what the Power Grid study told us about system needs for climate targets. And I just want to take some questions so we're all on the same page. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Liz. This has been very informative so far already. We have a couple of questions we've received from members so far throughout the webinar and in advance of the webinar. So we'll give you a couple of now and we'll save the rest until the end. The first question we have, does what is being discussed take into account the dramatically increased supply demand required to meet electric heating, electric vehicles, etc.?
Yes, it does. The Power Grid study, particularly the 100 by 40 aspect of the Power Grid study, projects the changes in demand, the increases in demand due to electrification, electric vehicles, etc. So yes, those future changes were modeled and are part of the story here. Yep.
Wonderful, thank you. Next question, New York residents already pay higher electric and tax bills than the national average. Who will pay for these grid upgrades and how much will rates increase?
Well, I can't tell you how much rates will increase. I can answer the larger question, at least a little bit. I have been focusing on those local upgrades that are expected to help us get a long way to the 2030 goals because those don't represent new expenditures. Those are ordinary course system maintenance costs that if we make those investments now, come with some additional flexibility and capacity benefits that are going to really take a big dent out of our 2030 needs. So those local transmission investments they're not additional to, they are ordinary utility capital expenditures. Many of them are already planned and already part of the utilities capital investment programs. So we're actually really pleased about that, because we think, we can leverage money we have to spend anyway, sadly, but we do, to maintain the system and capture a lot of CLCPA benefit. The phase 2 projects, the ones that are, not related to ordinary system maintenance, but rather are driven specifically by CLCPA needs, those are additional expenditures, yes. And ratepayers, unless something changes, ratepayers will have to absorb them. I can't tell you what those costs are. We certainly are working to get our arms around what that looks like. I wish I could tell you more, but at this stage, I really can't.
Thank you. Can you tell our members anything about the location of new or expansion transmission sites or the corridors that are proposed?
Well, we'll get to that a little bit in the second part of this discussion. So let's, come back to that.
Okay, great. We'll take 1 or 2 more questions before we get back to your presentation. Are utility companies preparing utility lines for the transition to renewable energy like solar, and the amount of power that is going to be produced?
Well, yeah, that's very much, again, we're gonna get into that in some detail, but yes, we've asked the utilities to, up their game as far as, specifically planning for these system needs. We'll be talking about that. So yes, they're very much involved. They will be very much involved going forward. Yep.
Excellent. We'll end with this question for now. Is there any level of local, official, or community input in this process?
We're going to talk about that again. There are a couple of different places where communities do have opportunities. In the planning process, we're working to refine the way the utilities do the planning, the development of, concept solutions, to include some stakeholder opportunities. And of course, once projects actually kind of get real and get into the siting, Article 7 or other siting processes, there are community opportunities there that your folks are probably aware of. But so yes, we do expect communities to have involvement.
Wonderful. Our members can continue to submit their questions on the questions panel of the GoToWebinar dashboard. We'll get back to Liz's presentation and take more questions at the end. Thank you again, Liz.
Sure. So having talked about the basics of the system needs and how we, determine them, what are we doing? What are we doing about that? So a year after the CLCPA was passed, the legislature enacted this Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act, which I'm going to talk about briefly here. There are many important things in that statute, but from my purposes and our purposes, the key element is the recognition that we have to rebuild the grid in order to integrate and to support all of this new renewable generation that will be coming online. The Act also, in that vein, requires the utilities to develop and publish specific plans for their distribution and transmission upgrades that are needed to meet those targets. And this is a new requirement. And to get there, in order to have plans that can be published, we realized that the Public Service Commission had to take a hand in establishing a brand new transmission planning processes to produce the specific system upgrade plans. Next slide, please. So in order to comply with the Act, the Commission has been, as I say here, laying the foundations. We've been implementing the provisions of the Act. Here are a couple of the high-level things that we're working on. One is to revamp long-term planning in order to make sure that the utilities are producing coordinated plans that focus on our CLCPA needs, in addition to all the things they already plan for, like reliability or resiliency or asset preservation. So we're trying to revamp we're trying to establish new processes to for the utilities to pursue. We've taken on the suggestion that we should pursue, the suggestion coming out of the power grid study that we should pursue phase 1 investments. The commission issued an order in February of 21 directing the utilities to identify phase 1 opportunities in their investment plans. And in response to that phase 1 order, both Avangrid and National Grid have brought pretty significant proposals to the commission for approval of phase 1 investments in their territories. And those proposed solutions are pending today. The commission and staff is reviewing them, and we're working through all of those proposals now. On offshore wind, the commission also took up the recommendation to create a new tie between Long Island and the mainland, and initiated a solicitation process for proposals, and we have a number of proposals that are now under review. That review is actually not conducted by the commission, it's conducted by the New York ISO, but the commission initiated the solicitation process, and we are very, very involved in that. Next slide. There's more. Phase 2, and those are the CLCPA driven projects. We knew from information we had from the NYSO, from NYSERDA, from developers, from a lot of parties, that we have currently 3 parts of the state where NYSERDA has been investing in renewable generation, but the existing transmission system is really not robust enough to support the existing generation, or the generation that's being constructed today, and the generation that NYSERDA expects to be built in these 3 areas. So we knew we had a problem, and the power grid study picked up on it as well. So the commission asked Avangrid, National Grid, and Central Hudson to propose phase 2 solutions to those what we call them bottling problems in those three areas. And again, the utilities have submitted their proposed solutions, and staff is reviewing those now. In addition, the commission asked all of the utilities to look at the larger system and to propose a portfolio of phase 2 solution projects, which they are due to file in January 2023. That is a few months from now. Next slide. These are the areas of concern that I mentioned that are the subject of the pending phase 2 filings. They are area Z, Y, and X in the dotted lines here, but kind of focused in the inside the red circles. Some of you probably know those areas, and maybe if you're particularly interested in what those proposals look like, I can follow up and tell you where you can find them. But again, we are trying to solve, it's sort of a good problem to have in a way. Generators responded very enthusiastically to the opportunity to interconnect in these areas, and they have kind of outstripped the local system's ability to handle all of that renewable energy. We need to catch up. So that's basically what that is about. Next slide. On offshore wind, remember the PGS, the power grid study said, oh, we need to understand and we need to clarify where are the interconnection points for, particularly for the expected 6 gigawatts of offshore wind that may come into New York City. So in response, Con Ed has recently proposed a renewable energy hub, which would be located in Brooklyn. I think it's sized to go up to 4.5 gigawatts, so almost all the way to the 6. Again, this proposal came in earlier this year. It's under review. And at the same time, we're also pursuing the power grid study's recommendation to look closely at cable routing options. So the commission is moving ahead on integrating the offshore wind both to Long Island and New York City. Next slide. But in my view, all of that stuff is interesting and important, and particularly important with respect to our short-term 2030 goals. But to me, the the planning process itself is kind of where we need to focus in terms of looking ahead even further. So we asked the utilities to propose a revised planning process that would do a better job of identifying and quantifying these additional transmission needs. So the utilities, with help from NYSO, NYSERDA, and renewable energy developers and other stakeholders, are working now on refining the initial proposals that were submitted by the utilities back in December of 21. The utilities gave us kind of a sketch of how they thought the planning process could be revised to meet the Commission's larger objectives. And we have a number of stakeholder groups working on refinements to that planning proposal. It's not the plan, it's the plan for the plan. The utilities are supposed to file a revised version of their planning process at the end of this year. There will be public comment opportunities on that revised proposal once it's in. So you can expect to see that in the first quarter of 2023. The aim here, is fundamentally to improve our planning, to make sure our planning is coordinated across utilities, in order to give the Public Service Commission and ultimately the public a comprehensive view of our transmission needs, that is the basis for future transmission investment, fundamentally the blueprint for the CLCPA and the zero carbon grid. Next slide. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm very anxious and eager to hear all of your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Liz. We do have quite a few questions from our members still. So
Great.
what you've discussed so far appears to have addressed plans for moving remotely produced renewables to the grid. What is going on for the quote unquote last mile issues?
There are a couple of things going on, but probably the most significant one is that the Accelerated Renewable Act requires the utilities to publish plans, as I said, and their plans are supposed to address distribution, all levels of the system, including that distribution one, that is essentially the last mile. I think honestly say you would be hard pressed to discern what any utility's local distribution plan is. So in conjunction with the planning, the development of the planning process that I talked about, we've been pushing the utilities to articulate their distribution planning processes more clearly, to bring stakeholders into that discussion. So I expect as part of that year-end filing, you will see provisions relating to how they identify needs on the local system, on the local distribution system, how they develop those solutions. So we're trying to bring that part of the planning process kind of more into light. I hope that answers the question.
I think it does. Thank you. Are provisions being made for new natural gas plants to provide reliable backup for what can be unreliable solar and wind generation?
New York State relies on market signals to support investment in generation. That's about the only thing I can say in response to that. We don't dictate from top down. So I think that's the best I can say.
Thank you. So the agricultural industry is a big part of a lot of rural communities, economies. There's a lot of concerns among our membership about agricultural land protection, both with siting and with transmission. Are there any agricultural land exemptions for transmission?
Let me answer that maybe in a couple of ways. I talked quite a bit about the 2030 needs and the local transmission upgrades, because an awful lot of that is going to be in existing rights of way. It's going to be upgrades to the to the facilities you see around you today. It's not going to be breaking greenfield. It's not going to be new development. It's going to be largely upgrading or expanding the facilities that are in the ground now. So the impact to ag lands from that sort of investment is, I think, going to be negligible. We're going to be, using the same land that that has been under utility, administration in some cases for decades. So that's one part of the answer. Are there ag land exemptions in terms of, where somebody could site a new transmission facility? No, not specifically, but the way Article 7 works is we try very hard to, in partnership with the developer or the utility, to identify minimally, the minimally impactful way to site a transmission line. And so a lot of time is spent on avoiding ag lands or mitigating impacts. So that's the kind of issue that gets worked out in the Article 7 process.
We also received a question about a regional issue some of our counties are dealing with. The Champlain Hudson Power Express installation in the Hudson River bottom might cause short-term pollution problems by stirring up mud with potential remaining PCB contamination. Is the state prepared to deal with possible opposition from environmental groups and this pollution itself?
That's a tough one to answer. That project's already been through an extensive siting project and has been permitted, and those issues were, I think, exhaustively discussed in the course of that siting process. And I think environmental groups spoke up, and there may be further opportunities. Opportunities for opposition could arise, but I think the state has done a pretty good job of tackling those issues when they came up in the permitting process, and it's a little hard to speculate. So that's my answer.
Mm-hmm. Another question we're receiving more and more from members recently is about the end of life of all of this infrastructure. Are there plans to develop statewide procedures for the disposal and recycling of renewable energy infrastructure at the end of its life?
Well, I think that question is really about generation. New York State has a transmission grid. It's been parts of it have been in the ground since about 1900. We have existing transmission facilities that are 70, 80 years old. We continue to maintain them because we continue to need them. And that's not going to change. Transmission assets are planned for a very long life. Generation is, I think people have maybe look at generation slightly differently. And in my experience, I used to work in wind power development. In my experience, there are decommissioning processes that come into play with at least some of those assets. I think that will probably continue into the future. So,
thank you. Please continue to submit your questions to the questions panel on the GoToWebinar dashboard. We have quite a few to get through, but we do have time for more questions if there are any more questions from the audience that haven't been asked yet. The next question I have for you, Liz, from our members: how is nuclear power and natural gas going to play out in the future needs of our energy plan?
So lots of people know way more about that than I do. We have committed to keeping the nuclear plants functioning for at least a certain period of time. We are trying to phase out natural gas generation responsibly and reliably where we can. It's hard to exactly see into the future, and that's part of the problem that we've kind of dumped onto the transmission planners' laps, which is, we're asking them to make some really important guesses about how we're going to transition from our current supply to the future renewable supply. And now, once they make those guesses, okay, now tell us where we need to invest in transmission. So, we're going to be, as the planning process develops, you'll see, the utilities will be putting out models of, how they think the system is going to evolve. Obviously, the assumptions you make in doing that modeling can be very, can have significant impacts on the outputs. But, that's where the rubber meets the road, is in trying to project what the system conditions are going to be and where the transmission investment has to go.
We have a follow-up to that question that we just got in. It will take a while before solar and wind plants come online. Should we worry as nuclear power plants are decommissioned and new natural plants are not brought online? What would the experience be? Could it be similar to California's brownouts?
No. No, we have a couple of safeguards in place that California doesn't or didn't have. Texas didn't have in the winter. We have the New York Independent System Operator, which is responsible for monitoring the system 24/7 and keeping it running reliably. And they have a lot of tools at their disposal to avoid the kinds of problems that we've seen in the past in California and more recently in Texas. The systems are just designed differently. I can't go into a lot of detail about that, but that's one significant element in our system that provides a lot of protection. The other thing is that as we look to the future, when planners sit down and they have to make their projections about what the system is going to look like, they have to plan within very strict parameters. They have to plan a system that will be reliable. And there are state reliability standards, there are federal reliability standards, there are regional reliability standards, there are sometimes utility-specific reliability standards, as in Con Ed, because they have a very unique system down there. So the planners have, very complex set of gates that they have to get through. And when they map out the future of the system, they have to incorporate those reliability standards so that the facilities that ultimately get built can be operated and kept reliable under all kinds of different system conditions. So that would, I hope that answers the question.
Yes, it's good to hear we won't be experiencing any brownouts like some other states have experienced.
I mean, you can come see me if we do, but
Wonderful. Is there any readily available data regarding the maximum load per interconnect in a region and an estimated exposure to reach greater line capacities? They add that this may be helpful in positioning projects in specific areas.
So I'm not 100% sure I understand the question. The thing that generators talk about is there adequate capacity for me to connect my wind plant here at this location? Does the transmission system have enough headroom to accommodate my energy? So I can get when the wind is blowing, I want to be able to get my energy on the system. Is there enough capacity here for me to do that? And that's a really critical question for them, because if the wind is blowing, they want to get paid. But if they can't get their energy onto the system, they don't get paid. So we're very focused on headroom issues. That really is part of what drives this whole, these investments. The idea is to, if there isn't headroom in an area where we know renewable development is coming, then should we create that headroom by investing in the transmission system in that location? That's basically, that's the basic question. There are follow-on questions like, well, okay, is it cost effective to invest in creating headroom in this place, or would it be more cost effective to create it over here? Those are things that we're going to have to juggle and are really very difficult problems to solve, because we have to anticipate where the generation is going to go, where the headroom is going to be needed, and how much, and try to make reasonable and smart decisions about where to put the transmission investment. But that's sort of the whole point, is to invest in the transmission system so that all of these new generators, or enough new generators, can get on the system to meet your needs in a reliable manner.
Sounds like you have your work cut out for you.
Yeah, it's a small job.
Let's take a couple more questions at the time we have left. A member mentions that seeker has not yet been mentioned, but is it fair to conclude that fund, undertake, approve, qualifying as seeker actions will subject the projects to seeker review?
No, transmission siting is, most transmission siting is exempt from seeker under Article 7. I don't want to say that that's a blanket statement, but it's generally true for most of, certainly the projects we're talking about here. And the environmental impact issues that seeker normally looks at are also considered in the Article 7 process.
We received a question specifically about electric vehicles. Could the current grid handle the conversion of 1/3 of the non-commercial auto fleet to electric vehicles?
Probably not. And that's part of what, that's part of what we are asking the utilities to do, is to project the transition to electric vehicles and building electrification, transportation electrification, to project all of those changes in the demand, the demand side, and tell us what we're going to need to upgrade the transmission system to accommodate those changes.
Our next question is a little more in the weeds. What are transmission losses associated with moving electricity from clean sources to end user vehicles?
Oh, I am not an engineer. I can only, in the most, probably, they would probably laugh. When you transmit electricity across a long distance, you lose a little, and that's what losses are. You don't get exactly the amount that was generated at point A delivered at point B.
We appreciate you sharing all the expertise that you do have. This has been extremely helpful and informative for our members. We'll end with two more general questions related to local government. First, how can local governments negotiate in relation to these transmission projects, and what can they realistically expect in terms of host community benefits?
Well, that's a little bit of a siting question. The typical, what you're likely to see in the next 8 or 9 years as we approach 2030, you're likely to see a number of these phase 1 projects moving forward. And again, these are upgrades to existing facilities all across the state that the utilities will be carrying out, in connection with their ordinary system maintenance work. Some of the projects will probably have to undergo some type of Article 7 review, even though it's using existing right-of-ways. There may be some that have to be reviewed. Others may get little to no review, because again, we're talking about upgrades to existing facilities that don't involve a lot of change to anything. So communities, when there is an Article 7 process with respect to one of these phase 1 projects, there will be the typical Article 7 community participation provisions. All of that will apply. If any phase 2 projects get approved in the next few years, particularly in those areas of concern that I mentioned, similarly, there will be Article 7 siting processes with respect to those. And again, the same community participation opportunities will be available.
I'll add in one more question we just received that is also a little bit more related to siting, but you may have some insights here. Will the scenic nature of our communities change as solar and wind projects are implemented?
Wow. That's phase 1 transmission projects are going to have little to no impact on the community scenic qualities, because again, it's going to be mostly upgrades to existing facilities. I know folks are concerned about generation plants appearing in places where they didn't used to be, and that does have some impact on people's what people see. Those scenic impacts of the generation siting, again, typically get reviewed either in a seeker process or in the state siting process. So again, where the emphasis is on, can we do this in the least impactful way? It's usually, that's the key question. But for transmission siting, I think in the next, the next phase, which is again upgrading existing facilities, I don't think you're going to see much change there. The line that you currently see today along the road is probably going to continue to be there, more or less exactly as it is.
Thank you. I think that's a helpful insight.
Okay.
Something we always like to end on, where would you direct our members to go to learn more about New York's climate goals, planned transmission system upgrades, other renewable energy topics that are of interest and important to local governments? What resources or contacts do you recommend that counties go to next to learn more?
Oh boy, that's a good one. All the developments and proposals that I've talked about here are come out of one case, one docket at the commission, and you can find the various filings and the commission's orders in that docket. The docket number is and I can't believe that I'm going to slip up on this one. 2021E-0197. So everything I've talked about here, in power grid study, the outputs of the power grid study, the utilities filings in response to the power grid study, the commission's orders, those are all in that docket and are visible. For information generally on the state's renewable programs, NYSERDA is usually a pretty good source for that. They run the procurement programs and the incentive programs that are in place to try to encourage generators to build in New York. So they have various tracking websites where I think you can probably find a lot of information there. I'm sorry I can't be more specific, but NYSERDA is where I would go, where I do go when I'm trying to find out, hey, where are we with respect to our solar goals? They keep track of those kinds of things.
I think that's very helpful. And for our members, if you do have questions, please feel free to follow up with me directly. We are happy to continue our education on this topic and put you in touch with state contacts who can answer any questions you may have.
I'll just add for myself, I'm also a little bit of a resource. I'm happy to have further conversations or help people out in understanding how to navigate around some of these issues. If you want to reach out to me, Alex, please do.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Liz. Your presentation was incredibly informative. I learned a lot. We really appreciate you answering all of these questions we've thrown at you. I want to thank NYPA again for sponsoring this session and for being one of NYSAC's partners. We really appreciate all of you, our members, joining us this morning, and we especially appreciate DPS partnering with us to bring you this important information about how the state plans to meet its very ambitious and aggressive Climate Act goals. Just a reminder that a recording of this webinar and a copy of the slides will be available on our website later today at nysac.org/webinars. That's all we have for this morning. Thank you again, Liz, and take care, everyone.
Thank you very much.